My name is Archie Dunham. I am 75 years old, and I live in what used to be my daughter's guest basement. The term guest is generous. It's more of a concrete box with a makeshift bed, a drafty window that doesn't open, and a rickety heater that hums like an old freight train but barely throws off any warmth. There is no closet, no door separating me from the utility sink and laundry machines, and at night, when the rest of the house falls asleep above me, I lie there listening to the rhythmic ticking of pipes, the occasional clang of the furnace, and, most piercing of all, the creaking footsteps of people I once called family moving about, oblivious to the man living beneath their feet like a ghost. I wasn't always a ghost. I was once a husband to the most beautiful woman I'd ever known, Marjorie, my late wife, who passed away 6 years ago this fall. We were married for nearly 50 years, and while those years weren't always easy, they were real, solid, earned. We built a life together in a modest farmhouse outside Des Moines, Iowa, where I worked for decades as a farm equipment mechanic, and she kept the books at the local post office. We raised a daughter, Arlene, who used to sit on my shoulders and call me her giant. For the longest time, I believed those memories had a kind of permanence, like carvings in stone. But time, I've come to learn, is a vicious eraser, especially when grief and greed get involved. After Marjorie died, suddenly, one Sunday morning, from an aneurysm that came and went before I could even call for help, I lasted about a year in that house. A year of silence, of overgrown hedges and unopened mail, of sitting alone at a dinner table meant for two. I remember once knocking over a coffee cup and crying for hours, not because of the mess, but because Marjorie wasn't there to remind me where we kept the napkins. It was Arlene who suggested I move in with her. "It'll be good for everyone," she said. "The kids will get to know you better, and you'll be surrounded by people who care." I wanted to believe her. God knows I did. At the time, she lived in a big, newly renovated house in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Cedar Rapids, with her husband Greg and their 2 teenage children, Jacob and Lily. I sold the farmhouse, below market, to a local family who promised to preserve the orchard Marjorie loved, and handed most of the proceeds over to Arlene to help with the addition. She promised me a room of my own, with windows and a proper bathroom, a recliner by the window, maybe even a little porch I could sit on in the mornings. I gave her $70,000 and a piece of my heart, thinking I was securing my place in a home, in a family. The room never materialized. The addition was built, yes, but it became an office for Greg, complete with custom cabinetry and a leather chaise that no one ever sat on. I was told there had been some changes to the plan, that construction costs had gone up, and that I could stay in the basement for a few months, just until we get everything settled. That was 3 years ago. No one talks about timelines anymore. They just call it your space, as if that word was supposed to elevate the airless corner I sleep in to something dignified. It wasn't just the physical downgrade that stung. It was the slow, almost imperceptible shifting of tone. The way Arlene's voice changed when she spoke to me. The way she stopped asking questions about my day. The way Greg never looked me in the eye, unless he needed something fixed. The grandchildren, who once greeted me with hugs and called me Papa Arch, now barely grunted when they passed me on the stairs. If I left a mug in the sink, Arlene would sigh and mutter about having to do everything herself. If I watched television after 9 p.m., Greg would knock on the floor above my head, a single sharp knock that meant, "Quiet down, old man." I tried to adapt. I bought noise-cancelling headphones, ate quietly in the basement, showered only when no one else was home. I folded their laundry without being asked, raked leaves in the fall, fixed a leaking pipe in the upstairs bathroom. I tried, with all the aching earnestness of a man desperate not to be discarded, to be useful, to be invisible, to be needed. And yet the more I gave, the less I seemed to matter. Arlene started calling me forgetful, scatterbrained. Once, when I left the front door unlocked by mistake, she told Greg in front of me that he's really slipping. Greg laughed and said I was one burnt toast away from the nursing home. It was a joke, I suppose, but I felt it like a slap. Another time, I asked Jacob if he wanted help with his car, an old Volvo that sputtered like a dying horse, and he shook his head and said, "You probably don't know how these new engines work anyway." I worked on combines and diesel tractors for 40 years, but to him, I was just an outdated man with outdated skills. I could have spoken up. I could have reminded them of who I used to be, of the things I'd sacrificed, the nights I stayed up tending to a sick child, the years I spent breaking my back so Arlene could go to college out of state, the times Marjorie and I ate beans so Arlene could have ballet lessons, but something stopped me. Pride, maybe, or fear, or that aching hope that things might get better if I just stayed quiet long enough. Sometimes, late at night, I lie awake and think about Marjorie. I imagine what she would say if she saw how things have turned out. I like to think she would have intervened, that she would have scolded Arlene, pulled her aside and reminded her what family means. But maybe not. Maybe she would have just sat beside me and held my hand in the dark, the way she used to when words failed us. That's the part I miss most, having someone on my side. In this house, I have no side. I have only silence and the slow, creeping erosion of dignity. I have a daughter who refers to me in the third person when talking on the phone, as if I'm not in the room. "He's doing okay, I guess," she'll say. "Still sleeping in the basement. Doesn't need much." And maybe I don't. Maybe I'm past needing. But I do remember. I remember everything. And lately, I've started to wonder, what exactly did I sign when I handed over that 70,000? Whose name is really on the deed to this house? What rights, if any, do I have? I've begun to ask myself questions I should have asked years ago. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that my time here, down in this basement, in this house, in this role they've written for me, is running out. I may be old, I may be tired, but I am not done yet. It was a Wednesday morning when the shift occurred. Subtle at first, almost laughably mundane, but in hindsight, it was the moment everything began to unravel. I had just finished making myself a cup of instant coffee on the hot plate in the corner of the basement, an act that had become a private ritual, mostly because I no longer felt welcome to use the main kitchen upstairs. The basement setup was primitive: a camping kettle, a chipped mug, a jar of freeze-dried coffee granules, and a battered spoon I had taken from the junk drawer upstairs one afternoon when no one was looking. I was stirring the coffee, letting the bitter aroma wrap around me like a familiar old blanket, when I heard footsteps descending the stairs, quick and clipped, followed by the voice of my daughter, unusually sharp and businesslike. "Dad, can we talk for a minute?" she asked without waiting for an answer. She entered the room without knocking, glancing around the cluttered space as if surveying a scene she had already mentally condemned. Her arms were crossed, and she wore that particular expression I had come to dread over the years. Tight-lipped patience masking irritation, the kind of look people give to someone who's overstayed their welcome at a dinner party. I nodded and gestured toward the folding chair across from the makeshift table. She didn't sit. Instead, she remained standing and began with a sigh that told me everything I needed to know before a single word had been spoken. "Greg and I have been talking," she said, "and we think it's time to make some changes." I held my mug in both hands and said nothing, waiting for the blow I knew was coming. "The basement isn't really working out," she continued. "The kids need a space for their music and their friends, and honestly, it's just not practical anymore to have you down here. It's not good for your health, and it's not good for the household dynamic. I blinked at her. You want me to move out? I asked, keeping my voice as even as I could, though I could already feel the slow boil of something bitter rising in my chest. She gave a tight smile. No, of course not. We just think it might be better, for everyone, if you moved into the garage apartment. The garage apartment. That was new. To my knowledge, it was still an unfinished shell above the detached garage, filled with boxes, tools, and the skeletal remains of a failed home gym Greg had ordered during the pandemic. There's no plumbing, I said quietly. No insulation. Arlene nodded as if she had anticipated this line of objection and come prepared. Greg's going to handle that, she said. He's already called a contractor. We'll make it comfortable. Heat, water, a little kitchenette. Think of it as your own place. You'll have more privacy, and the kids will have their space back. I wanted to ask when the basement had become theirs in the first place, but I bit my tongue. It wouldn't have mattered. In this house, nothing belonged to me, not even the ground beneath my feet. In the meantime, she went on, we'll set you up in the mudroom just off the garage. It's temporary, just for a few weeks. The mudroom was a glorified broom closet, a narrow space with tile floors and no windows. I had once stored my toolbox there before Greg had claimed it for his sporting equipment. I set my mug down and folded my hands on the table. I don't understand, I said. What did I do? Arlene's face softened, or at least tried to. Nothing, she said too quickly. It's not about you, it's just... things evolve. The kids are older now. Lily needs space for her cello, and Jacob's drum kit is taking up half the garage. We all need to adapt. I wanted to tell her that I had adapted. I had given up everything, my home, my autonomy, my dignity, for the sake of being close to her, to them. I wanted to remind her of the money I had contributed, of the promises she had made. I wanted to scream that I had been relegated to a concrete hole for 3 years without complaint. But I didn't say any of that. I nodded, slowly, and asked, When? The contractor starts next Monday, she said. So this weekend Greg will help you move your things. We'll get a cot set up in the mudroom and clear a path so you can come and go easily. I sat in silence as she turned and walked back up the stairs, her footsteps fading into the sound of a vacuum cleaner somewhere overhead. I stayed there for a long time, not moving, the air in the basement suddenly too still, too heavy. I looked around the room, at the worn blankets neatly folded at the foot of my cot, the old bookshelf filled with paperbacks I'd read a dozen times, the photo of Marjorie and me on our wedding day that I kept propped up on an overturned milk crate I used as a nightstand. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And now, even that was being taken. That afternoon, I went for a walk. It wasn't something I did often anymore, not since my right knee had started giving me trouble. But I needed air, motion, distance from the house. I walked to the edge of the subdivision, past manicured lawns and American flags fluttering in the breeze, past neighbors who nodded politely without ever asking my name. I ended up at a small park near the edge of a retention pond, where a single bench sat beneath a weeping willow tree. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the water ripple under the wind, listening to the distant shrieks of children on a jungle gym, trying to understand how everything had gotten so far from what I had imagined. I wasn't naive. I knew I was aging. I knew I wasn't always easy to live with. But I had believed deeply, stubbornly, in the idea that family meant something. That when the chips were down, your people didn't just find a place to stash you like unwanted furniture. They found a way to make you feel human. I thought of Marjorie again. I thought of what she would say if she were here, probably something like, "You don't have to stay where you're not wanted." And I think for the first time in all these years I started to believe her. When I returned home, I found that Greg had already begun moving boxes out of the mudroom. Figured I'd get a jump start, he said casually, as if we were talking about rearranging furniture and not the forced displacement of a human being. There's a spare cot in the attic. It's got a bit of a sag, but we'll throw a board under it. You'll be fine. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. I walked past him, down into the basement, and began folding my blankets. Each movement felt weighted, ceremonial. I placed my books into an old cardboard box, carefully laid the photo of Marjorie on top, and sealed it with tape. I didn't cry. Not then. Not when I lay on the cot in the mudroom that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the roar of the dryer and the clatter of shoes being kicked off in the adjacent hallway. But something inside me shifted, the faint, crumbling foundation of hope that had kept me in this house, in this arrangement, in this fantasy of belonging. It cracked, just enough to let the light in. And that light, thin as it was, carried a single, burning question. What if I didn't have to live like this? What if there was a way to take back something, not revenge, exactly, but justice, clarity, closure? I didn't know the answer yet, but for the first time in a long time, I knew I wanted one, and I intended to find it. The weekend arrived with a kind of heavy finality, the way autumn settles over a once-summered garden, slow, inevitable, and cruel in its quietness. Greg spent most of Saturday in a flurry of performative efficiency, striding between the garage and the house with his sleeves rolled up and a Bluetooth headset in his ear, barking half-sentences about insulation, wiring, square footage, and dads. New digs, like he was managing a commercial property renovation rather than orchestrating the demotion of an old man from one layer of domestic relevance to another. I watched him through the narrow pane of glass in the mudroom door, my face half obscured by the dusty curtain that hung there, unnoticed for years. Occasionally he would wave at me with an exaggerated grin, like we were partners in some grand project, and not prisoner and warden. I never waved back. I simply watched, noting how easily my existence was folded into logistics, how seamlessly my needs had become tasks on a checklist, no different from replacing a light bulb or resealing the driveway. That morning, as I moved my final box from the basement to the mudroom, I passed Jacob in the hallway. He didn't meet my eyes. His headphones were in, and he muttered something, maybe a greeting, maybe a complaint, but it was lost beneath the thrum of bass and indifference. I paused for a moment, thinking of the boy he used to be, the one who begged me to push him on the swing until my arms ached, the one who brought me his drawings and asked if tractors could smile. I wanted to say something, anything, but all that emerged was a tired breath. He passed me without a glance. The mudroom was colder than I expected. Even with the cot set up, a small electric heater plugged into the wall, and a new blanket folded neatly on top, the room felt like a holding cell. There were no windows, and at night the only sound was the hum of the garage door opener and the occasional scratching of something in the walls. Mice, perhaps, or just my imagination, working overtime in the dark. I tried to make the space livable. I arranged my books on the narrow shelf above the coat hooks, stacked my clothes in 2 plastic bins beneath the cot, and propped Marjorie's photo on top of my suitcase. I told myself it was temporary. I repeated the word like a mantra. Temporary, transitional, necessary. But each morning I awoke with a deeper ache in my bones, a greater sense of displacement, as though I were dissolving one cell at a time into the very air of that narrow, forgotten corridor. Sunday evening brought the first confrontation. Arlene stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, watching me as I rinsed a plate. "You don't need to do that," she said, her voice flat. We have a system. I looked at her, unsure of what system she meant. I had always washed my own dishes, quietly, thoroughly, after everyone else had finished. "It's just one plate," I said. "I'll be done in a second." She exhaled sharply. "Greg doesn't like anyone touching the sink after dinner. It's a hygiene thing." I wanted to ask when that rule had started, and whether it applied to her or just to me. But instead I dried the plate, placed it carefully in the cabinet, and backed away. The next morning, I found a note taped to the mudroom door. It was written in Arlene's familiar cursive, the same script she had once used to leave me birthday cards and crayon love letters. "Please refrain from using the kitchen after 7 p.m. We will provide meals for you in the evenings. Leave any dirty dishes in the bin outside the garage. Thank you for understanding." There was no signature, just a little smiley face at the end, as if that softened the blow. The meals came in plastic containers, left on the step like offerings to a recluse. They were bland, portion-controlled, and almost always cold by the time I found them. I ate them silently, sitting on the edge of the cot, using a single fork I washed in the utility sink, drying it with a paper towel I'd folded and reused until it was soft as cloth. The meals were never enough to truly satisfy. Small slabs of chicken, steamed vegetables, rice measured by the spoonful. No dessert, no seasoning, no dignity. One night I opened the container to find a single boiled egg and a piece of dry toast. I laughed, though it wasn't funny. It was the kind of laugh that rattled in my throat like a cough. That same night, I tried to sneak a banana from the kitchen. It was after 10, and the house was silent, the only light a flickering bulb over the stove. I moved quietly, as I had learned to do, like a man on foreign territory. I had just reached for the fruit bowl when I heard footsteps. Arlene appeared in the doorway, her robe cinched tight, her hair wrapped in a towel. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. I held up the banana like a weapon. I was hungry. She stared at me for a long moment, then sighed. "You can't just help yourself. Greg's very particular about inventory. If you need something, ask." Inventory, as if the house were a store and I was a shoplifter. I nodded, muttered an apology, and returned to the mudroom with the banana tucked beneath my arm like contraband. I didn't eat it that night. I left it on the shelf beside Marjorie's photo, a small yellow symbol of what my life had become. A week later, the thermostat disappeared from the mudroom wall. I had adjusted it the night before, trying to warm the room after a particularly damp morning, and the next day, it was gone. When I asked Arlene, she smiled and said, "We're trying to keep the bills down. Those little adjustments add up." I opened my mouth to protest, then closed it. I bought a small space heater at a second-hand store 3 miles away, using the last of the cash I kept in a zippered pouch in my sock drawer. Greg saw it later that week and warned me about fire hazards. "You burn this place down, and we all go down with you," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe think about sleeping with a bucket of water next to your cot." I laughed. I had to. But that night, I lay awake with the heater turned off, afraid of causing a spark. I wrapped myself in 2 blankets and listened to the sound of the water softener cycling in the garage. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere a life was being lived. But not here. Not by me. One evening I heard laughter from the dining room. Arlene, Greg, the kids, a dinner party perhaps, or just a family gathering I was not invited to. I stood at the mudroom door, my ear pressed to the wood, listening to the cadence of their joy. I imagined them passing dishes, pouring wine, discussing their day. No one mentioned me. Of that I was sure. I was a spectre, a forgotten relic relegated to the periphery. And yet I was not entirely powerless. That realization came slowly, like the first flicker of dawn after a long, cold night. One morning, while searching for an old sweater, I found the folder, tucked behind a stack of winter blankets in the basement closet, a manila envelope with my name written on it in my own handwriting. Inside were the documents from the sale of the farmhouse, the transaction records, the deed transfer forms. And there, in crisp black ink, was the line I had nearly forgotten. In consideration of partial contribution towards down payment, Mr. Archibald Dunham shall be included as joint tenant with right of survivorship. I stared at the line for a long time, my fingers trembling. Joint tenant. Not a gift, not a loan. Ownership. My name was on the deed. I wasn't just a guest. I wasn't a dependent. I was legally, financially, and morally a co-owner of the very house I was being exiled from. A strange calm settled over me as I returned the documents to their envelope and slid them into my suitcase beneath the cot. I didn't say anything to Arlene or Greg. Not yet. But from that moment on, something in me shifted. The humiliation no longer stung in quite the same way. The cold dinners, the restrictions, the muttered complaints. They were still cruel, still petty. But now they existed in a different context. I had leverage. I had truth. And perhaps most importantly, I had a spark. Small, yes, but undeniable. A spark that said, I may be down here, in this mudroom, sleeping beside utility meters and winter boots, but I am not finished. Not yet. The breaking point came, as these things often do, not with a scream or a slap or a dramatic outburst, but with a polite knock on the mudroom door and the thin, almost apologetic voice of my daughter saying, We need to talk. It was late afternoon, and I had been sitting on my cot reading the same paragraph of an old John Steinbeck novel over and over, unable to concentrate. I put the book down and opened the door to find Arlene standing with a clipboard in one hand and what looked like a folder of printed documents in the other. Her expression was somewhere between businesslike and strained, the kind of face people wear when they're about to ask you to do something they know you won't like. "Can we sit?" she asked, glancing around the narrow space, as if suddenly realizing it offered no chairs, no hospitality. I gestured toward the cot, and she perched awkwardly on the edge, smoothing her skirt, taking care not to touch anything. Greg was just outside the door, arms folded, sunglasses perched on his head despite the overcast day, his presence clearly not incidental. Arlene cleared her throat. "So," she began, "we've been thinking a lot lately about the future, your future, and we want to make sure everything is in place, legally, medically, financially, just to protect you, you know, in case something happens." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I already knew where this was going. She opened the folder and took out a stack of papers. "This is a power of attorney form," she said, her tone careful, coaxing. "It just means that in the event you become unable to make decisions, say due to illness or an accident, we'd be authorized to manage things on your behalf. Your accounts, your health decisions, just as a safeguard." I looked at the top page. My name was there, printed neatly at the top, a blank space for a signature below. "And this?" I asked, gesturing toward the other documents. "Just a few medical release forms." She said too quickly. "Standard things. HEPA waivers, a healthcare proxy, that sort of thing. We've already spoken to a lawyer, and he said this is very common, especially at your age." I studied her face. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Greg shifted his weight just outside the door, clearly waiting for this to be over. I reached for the pen she offered me and held it loosely in my hand. "And what happens?" I asked, "if I say no?" Arlene blinked. "Nothing," she said after a pause. "Of course nothing. This is voluntary. We just thought it would be easier, for everyone, if things were clear. Clear for whom? I asked, more sharply than I intended. She flushed. Dad, please don't make this into a thing. We're just trying to help. I put the pen down on the cot beside me. You can leave the papers, I said. I'll review them. Arlene hesitated, then nodded. Of course. No pressure. She rose, smoothing her skirt again, and Greg gave a little grunt of approval as they walked away. I waited until I heard the kitchen door close behind them, then picked up the papers and placed them carefully in the suitcase beneath my bed, beside the folder with the deed. I had no intention of signing anything, but now I had confirmation. Undeniable, printed, notarized confirmation of their intent. That night I didn't sleep. I sat up with the light from my small reading lamp casting shadows on the walls, thinking not just about what they had asked, but why. It wasn't care, it wasn't concern, it was control, a legal pathway to siphon off what little I had left under the guise of responsibility. I thought of the bank account I had shared with Arlene since she was in college, an account I still used to send small monthly transfers to help with the kids. Though no one had asked for or acknowledged them in years, I thought of the car in the garage registered in my name and Greg's, the one he drove to work each day without so much as a thank you. I thought of the house, their house, they always said, but whose deed bore my name as well. I had let so much go, excused so much under the banner of family, of forgiveness, of hope. But now, with the evidence in my hands, the documentation of their duplicity laid bare, I felt something settle inside me. A quiet, determined fury. They wanted authority over my life. They wanted to reduce me to a line item on a spreadsheet, a liability to be managed. But they had made one mistake. They had underestimated me. The next morning, I took the bus to town. I wore my old jacket and the only pair of shoes that didn't pinch my toes, and I carried a tote bag with the deed folder and the unsigned documents. I went first to the public library, used a guest computer to look up elder law attorneys in the area, and wrote down 3 names. Then I walked, slowly, with effort, to the nearest office on the list, a modest building tucked between a bakery and an insurance agency. I was sweating by the time I arrived, but I stood a little straighter when I stepped inside. The receptionist was young, polite, and mildly startled when I said I didn't have an appointment. But she checked the calendar and nodded. Mr. Arkin is free in about 20 minutes. Would you like to wait? I sat in the corner of the waiting room, staring at a faded painting of a sailboat. My fingers curled tightly around the handle of my bag. When they called my name, I rose with care and followed the receptionist down the hall. Mr. Arkin was a man in his 50s, with silver hair and a warm but sharp gaze. He listened as I laid out the facts, about the basement, the mudroom, the meals, the power of attorney papers, the joint deed, the co-owned car, the account I still funded each month. I showed him the documents. He read them carefully, asked a few pointed questions, and finally leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful nod. You have options, he said, more than they probably realize. He explained the concept of partition by sale, how a co-owner of a property could force its sale through the courts if an agreement couldn't be reached. He talked about power of attorney abuse, about financial exploitation of the elderly, about how easily neglect could become a legal matter when documented properly. He didn't promise revenge, he promised process. And for the first time in years, I felt something close to control. I left his office with a list of next steps, a referral to a financial advisor, and a renewed sense of purpose. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window and watched the city slide past, not as a blur of things I had lost, but as a series of things I might still recover. I wasn't naive. I knew the path ahead would be slow, complicated, and filled with resistance. But I also knew, with the clarity of a man who had sat alone in too many rooms, that I was done waiting for someone to rescue me. I would rescue myself. It began, as most betrayals do, not with confrontation, but with the subtle shift of air in a room, a sense of being watched, managed, weighed like inventory on some invisible scale. After my visit to Mr. Arkin, I returned to the house with a new steadiness in my spine, though I showed nothing outwardly. I smiled when appropriate, nodded when spoken to, accepted my boxed dinners without complaint, and responded to Arlene's questions in the same distant, quiet tone I'd perfected over years of shrinking in my own daughter's home. But inside, something fundamental had changed. I began to observe the house and its inhabitants the way one studies the enemy's camp before a siege, not with anger, but with strategic patience. I noticed how Greg always carried his briefcase out to the car, but rarely drove further than the neighborhood cafe. I saw how Arlene spent long hours on her laptop in the kitchen, headphones in, but her fingers didn't type, they scrolled. I saw the mail pile up by the door, and I waited until no one was home to check the envelopes, noting that 2 of them were addressed to Arlene Dunham, primary caregiver for Archibald Dunham, with seals from a state elder services bureau I had never heard of. I copied the contact information and tucked it away. Then came the incident with the phone call. One evening, just after 8, the landline rang in the kitchen. Arlene was upstairs, Greg nowhere in sight, and for a moment I stood in the doorway, unsure if I should answer. But instinct took over, an old, reflexive politeness. And I picked up. A woman's voice greeted me, soft and official, identifying herself as a representative from the Office of Adult Protective Services. She asked for Arlene and explained that she was following up on a report of diminished capacity and potential self-neglect. My breath caught. I asked what the report was based on. She hesitated. "I'm sorry, I can't discuss case details with you unless you're the listed contact or legal guardian." I told her I was the subject of the inquiry. Another pause. "I see," she said. "In that case, would you be willing to verify a few details? Your date of birth, your residence, your emergency contacts?" I answered her calmly, clearly. Then I asked, "What specifically is the concern?" Her voice was careful, hedging. The initial report suggested confusion, difficulty maintaining personal hygiene, and possible hoarding behavior. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. "Come visit," I said. "You'll see for yourself." My living space is small but clean. My mind is intact. And I brush my teeth twice a day, thank you. She said she would follow up and thanked me for my time. When Arlene came downstairs an hour later, I was still sitting at the table, the receiver beside me. She gave me a strange look, then reached for the phone to check for messages. Her hand froze halfway. "Someone called," I said. "Adult Protective Services. They said someone filed a report about me." She tried to play it cool, but her eyes widened just a fraction too much. "That's probably a mistake," she said. "There are a lot of scams going around. You shouldn't talk to people on the phone like that." I nodded. "Maybe I'll call them back tomorrow, just to be sure." Her face tightened. "There's no need. I'll take care of it." And that was when I knew, truly knew, that she was afraid. Not of what I might say, but of what I might prove. The next few days passed in uneasy silence. Arlene no longer left my meals on the mudroom step. She knocked, forced a smile, handed them to me personally. Greg stopped making jokes about fire hazards. Jacob and Lily were ghosts, avoiding me altogether. I used the quiet to begin gathering what Mr. Arkin had called a dossier of mistreatment. I took photographs of my living conditions, time-stamped with my old flip phone, I made notes of every restriction placed on my movement, every denial of access to shared household resources, every moment I was treated less like a father and more like a tenant with no lease. One afternoon I caught Arlene rifling through my suitcase when she thought I was out. She made an excuse about looking for towels and fled the room before I could confront her. I moved the deed papers to the bottom of my laundry hamper and started locking the mudroom door whenever I left. Then came the most brazen move yet. I went to the bank, as I had done every month for years, to withdraw cash from the joint account I still technically shared with Arlene, only to find it frozen. The teller, an older woman who had known me by name for decades, looked apologetic. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Dunham. There's been a hold placed on the account, pending investigation." "What investigation?" I asked. "We can't say, but it was initiated by the secondary account holder." I thanked her, left, and called Mr. Arkin from the payphone outside. "They're trying to choke me off," I said. "Then it's time," he replied. "We'll file for partition. We'll notify the bank. And we'll get you examined by a court-appointed psychiatrist just in case they try to claim diminished capacity again." The next week was a blur of paperwork, notarized statements, legal forms, and appointments. I underwent a full cognitive assessment at a clinic downtown. The doctor was kind, methodical, and at the end of it all said, "You're sharper than most of my 40-year-old patients." I passed every test. I documented it all. Arlene, oblivious to what was coming, continued her routine, though I noticed a new restlessness in her movements, a sharpness in her voice when she spoke to Greg behind closed doors. Once I caught them whispering in the kitchen, and when I entered, the room fell silent. I made tea and left without a word. And then came the moment that tipped everything. I returned one afternoon to find the mudroom door unlocked and my suitcase open, its contents rifled through. The deed folder was gone. I ran upstairs and found Arlene at the kitchen counter, the folder in front of her, the documents splayed out like a fan. "You shouldn't have hidden this from us," she said coldly. "This changes things." I stepped forward. "That's my property." "It's our house," she snapped. "And you tricked us. You made us think it was a gift." "It was never a gift," I said. "I gave you $70,000. You signed the deed yourself." "You knew." Greg entered the room, arms crossed. "We've been good to you," he said. "And this is how you repay us? Threatening court? Selling the house out from under your own daughter?" I stared at him. "You locked me in a mudroom. You left me meals like a prisoner. You tried to steal legal authority over my life. And now you're surprised I'm fighting back?" Arlene's face twisted, some mixture of rage and panic. "You're going to regret this," she said. "You don't want to die alone, do you?" I almost laughed. Better alone than surrounded by thieves. I reached forward, took the folder, and walked out. Behind me, their voices rose in argument, not with me, but with each other. Something had cracked in their alliance, and I could feel it. That night, I packed my few belongings, locked the mudroom door one last time, and took a cab to a small motel near the edge of town. I didn't leave a note. I didn't owe them that. The next morning, I visited Mr. Arkin's office and signed the formal petition for the sale of the house. The battle had begun, and this time, I wasn't going to fight it quietly. The call from Mr. Arkin came just after sunrise, the kind of hour when the world still feels suspended between sleep and reality, when even the air hesitates. I had spent the night in the armchair by the motel window, watching headlights roll silently across the parking lot, my suitcase by the door, unopened. I had slept in my clothes, too restless to lie down, too focused to close my eyes. The voice on the line was steady, calm, and strangely energized. "It's official," Arkin said. "The court has approved the petition. the sale can proceed. You are free to notify a broker, list the property, and if your daughter refuses to comply, we can pursue forced partition through sale enforcement. It's not common, but it's legal. The judge reviewed your ownership documents, the cognitive assessments, and your statement. He found your position valid and compelling. I doubt they saw it coming. I said nothing for several seconds, processing the shift, the magnitude of it all, the simple but irreversible weight of those words. You are free. That afternoon, I returned to the house for the first time in 2 weeks. I walked up the front path slowly, noting the weeds curling through the cracks in the walkway, the dying geraniums in the planter by the door. I rang the bell, though I still had keys in my pocket. It was Arlene who opened the door. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression exhausted, and for a moment I almost didn't recognize her. She looked older, not in the way of time, but in the way of strain, like someone who had been living inside a nightmare of her own creation and now couldn't quite find the exit. "You're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, stepped inside, and was struck by the surreal familiarity of it all. The faint lemon scent of the wood polish, the framed family photos, the low hum of the refrigerator, the echo of footsteps overhead. But it was no longer my house. Not in the emotional sense. That illusion had been burned away. Greg sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him. He didn't look up as I entered, didn't offer a word of greeting. I stood in the center of the room and spoke evenly. "The sale is happening. You have 30 days to vacate or contest, but I assure you that contesting it will only make things worse. I have documentation, legal standing, and court approval. This isn't negotiable anymore." Arlene moved to the counter, leaned on it as if her legs had grown weak, and muttered, "You're tearing this family apart." I turned to her. "What family? The one that locked me in a mudroom and stole from me? The one that filed false reports to Adult Protective Services and froze my finances? That's not a family. That's a hostile merger." Greg finally looked up then, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You think this makes you righteous?" he said. "It just makes you bitter. You couldn't stand being irrelevant, so now you're burning the house down." I stepped closer. "I was never irrelevant. You just convinced yourselves I was. But let me remind you, this house was built with my money. I gave you a future, and you tried to erase me from it. All I'm doing now is reclaiming what's mine." Arlene folded her arms across her chest. "And what do you want? An apology? A parade? You want us to grovel?" "No," I said quietly. "I want you to understand that actions have consequences. I want you to live with the knowledge that you gambled your family's future on the assumption that I would always stay silent, and I want you gone." The silence that followed was thick, nearly physical. I could see Arlene's chest rise and fall with shallow, uneven breaths, could hear the faint click of Greg's jaw as he clenched it. I waited, letting the weight of my words settle. Finally, Greg stood, closed the laptop, and said, "You'll hear from our lawyer." I smiled faintly. "Good. Mine is expecting it." Then I turned and walked back towards the door. Before I could leave, I paused by the hallway table, the one where Marjorie's photo used to sit. It was gone. In its place was a scented candle and a decorative tray with keys. I said nothing. I opened the door and walked into the sunlight, leaving the house behind for the last time, not as a victim, not as a burden, but as a man who had finally taken back control of his life from the people who tried to dismantle it, piece by piece. That night, back in the small apartment I had rented across town, I sat at the window and stared out over the lake. The water reflected the fading light like a polished mirror, and in its surface I could see the outlines of things I had lost. Yes, but also the faint, emerging shape of what I had regained. Clarity, autonomy, dignity. The phone rang once around 8. I didn't answer. I let it ring, then fall silent, then ring again. Eventually it stopped. I sat in that silence for a long time, breathing it in like medicine. The house sold within 6 weeks, faster than even the broker expected, snapped up by a young couple from Minneapolis who planned to renovate and start a family. I never met them, never stepped foot inside again after that last confrontation, but I signed the documents at Mr. Arkin's office, accepted the cashier's check with my half of the proceeds, and left the building with my shoulders lighter than they had felt in years. Arlene never contested the sale, never returned my calls, never sent a letter, and I didn't pursue contact. Greg, I heard through Arkin, had moved out temporarily, claiming undue stress as justification for breaking their lease on the condo they rented while the house sat in escrow. I didn't follow up. There was nothing left for me there. Not vengeance, not explanation, not even a shred of curiosity. What needed to happen had happened. The moral balance had tipped, not in violence or courtroom spectacle, but in the quiet, stubborn truth of the deed and my refusal to vanish. I moved into a small 2-bedroom bungalow on the southern edge of town, a low-slung home with creaky floors, mismatched shutters, and a porch that looked out over a line of pine trees. It was modest, drafty, and in desperate need of a new roof, but it was mine, paid for in full, free of apology. I spent the first few weeks unpacking slowly, deliberately, placing my books on the shelves, my tools in the shed, and Marjorie's photo by the kitchen window, where the morning light hit her smile just right. I cooked for myself, walked each evening along the canal path behind the neighborhood, and learned the names of my neighbors' dogs before I learned their own. I started going to the library again, volunteering at the hardware co-op on Wednesdays, attending the early service at a chapel where no one knew my history or asked why my daughter never visited. In time, I grew used to the quiet, not as punishment, but as freedom. Silence on my own terms became a balm rather than a sentence. There were moments, of course there were, when the ache caught me off guard. At night, sometimes I would wake in the dark and forget where I was, half expecting to see the outline of furnace pipes overhead, or hear the shuffle of Greg's slippers on the floor above me. But those moments passed, and in their place came something else, something more potent than grief or anger. Clarity. I no longer needed to be forgiven or understood by the people who had failed me. I had been a good father. I had shown up. I had paid, fixed, carried, consoled. And when it was my turn to need, not much, just warmth, respect, a seat at the table, they had turned me into a logistical inconvenience. There was no fixing that. There was only truth, and in accepting it, I had liberated myself from their version of who I was supposed to be. One afternoon in late spring, I received a letter, handwritten, unsteady, postmarked from a town 2 hours west. It was from Lily. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't understood. She said her mother told them things that made her scared of me, confused about what was true. She asked if she could visit. I wrote back simply, kindly, and said yes. I told her I had tea in the cupboard and 2 rocking chairs on the porch, and that she'd be welcome any time. That was all I wrote. I didn't need to say more. Some bridges, if not burned, could be crossed again slowly, one careful step at a time. Now, most mornings, I sit on the porch with a blanket across my knees and Marjorie's photo beside me, sipping coffee and watching the sun rise over the trees. The pain of what happened hasn't vanished, but it has settled, found its place among the deeper strata of memory where it no longer screams but merely hums. And in its quiet, I've found something like peace. Not in reconciliation, but in reclaiming the parts of myself that were never truly lost, only hidden. I am not a victim. I am not a relic. I am a man who said enough. And when I said it, I meant it. That was the day I got my life back.